thank you for being here. Thank you for the invitation to the Enterprise Initiative. Today I would like to share with you some of the results I have been doing in my research from from two areas. One is the empirical analysis, the second one is the theoretical framework. And what I want to show you today to you is that both of them seem to encompass very nice results. And even though we have a very simple framework, we can predict a lot of the observed features in the empirical data. So my research focused on analyzing the contractual characteristics of corporate credit in Mexico. And for doing the research, I would like to introduce a matching framework to add some content to the characteristics of the contract and derive some nice properties about the market. Before going anywhere, I would like to introduce the topic by having this beautiful phrase I found in Schumpeter's work, The Theory of Economic Development, which basically motivates what I'm doing. Schumpeter says that credit is essentially the creation, with an emphasis by me, by the way, of purchasing power for the purpose of transferring to the entrepreneur, but not simply the transfer of current purchasing power. So the creation of purchasing power characterizes in principle the method by which development is carried out. And it's only through this creation of value that economic development will rise from the mere cycle of perfect equilibrium and is the keystone of modern credit structure. So what Schumpeter said here is that the credit markets are not only transferring value from one set of agents to the other, but what they actually doing is creating something. And what I would like to prove to you today is that somehow we are able to recover the idea of creation of purchasing power in terms of the relationships we observe in the credit market. So what this approach is about, what this presentation is about, is to introduce an assignment model with two-sided search to analyze the incentives of matching in the credit market. For doing this, I would like to define the structure of the credit market as the number of transactions held at the market, the assortative bank-client relationships, and the hedonic implied equilibrium distributions of interest rates that arise from this optimal interaction between banks and clients. Then, with this framework, what I would like to do is to perform an empirical assessment of the model to address one important feature of the Mexican credit market between 2004 and 2007. And for doing this, I would like to introduce a beautiful set of databases that allows me to have information not only on the equilibrium of contracts, but also having specific information for each bank in the transaction and each firm at the transaction. So basically, I will have information for supply, demand, and equilibriums contracts. And by doing this, I will be able to predict, unless up to some scale, the observed dynamic in the credit market structure by only analyzing the increase in the activity in the market. Obviously, because all this framework is new applied to these sort of problems, the work I'm presenting introduced a whole research agenda on how to estimate, calibrate, and test the framework using the empirical content of the databases. And at the same time, we can go further by changing the basic assumptions of the model I'm going to introduce, by maybe introducing some natural extensions to the credit market, such as asymmetric information, searching cost, or other markets that can complement the one I'm going to start. Okay, well, this is a tragic picture. For those of you who are Mexicans, you know the story. For those of you who are not Mexicans, I will tell you that in 1995, we have a crisis, huge crisis. The worst financial crisis in Mexican history. And what this figure is showing is the tragic of the banking system in Mexico. In 1995, starting 1995, the total portfolio that the banking system has lent at the market was almost 50% of the GDP. Then suddenly, we have a huge contraction in the banking activity. This huge contraction lasts since 1995 to 2000, and then starts to stabilize by 2001. This picture is divided in three stages. The first stage is the contraction, which shows the big decrease in the banking activity, measured as the total credit given by the banking system. And I defined two measures of credit, the total credit and the corporate credit. The two measures fall dramatically from 50 and 33% to less than 10% and less than 20%. Then we have a period of recovery, where the banking activity stabilizes, and then by the end of 2005 and the beginning of 2006, the central bank recognizes that the banking system starts to lend again to the economy, and then we have a rise on the banking activity on these two markets. Obviously, if we see the whole perspective, we cannot appreciate how important is the last track of the databases. So if we do a zooming, what this is telling you is that from 2006 to 2007, the banking activity increased almost in 5% of the GDP for the total credit, and almost in 3% for the corporate credit, in just 2 years. After a lot of period without increasing in the total lending resources, in just 2 years we have this huge increase in the total resources lent at the market. So this is for the whole market. But what else that we have supporting this increasing in the banking activity? Well, if we analyze another measures of banking indicators of performance, we have the number of branches and the number of personnel hired at the banking system. So I created a basic index of 1 for March 2000 divided by quarters, and we will see that the increase in banking activity measured by the number of branches and the personnel, if we take the first quarter of 2000 as the basis, shows a huge increase also for the last period 2006 and 2007, measured at the number of workers and branches at the market. For instance, for the last period, in just 2 years, there was an increase from almost 20%. And this increase is not observed for the whole period, by the way. So this is the second piece of evidence that the bank system in the credit market is like having a higher activity up to some point. What about the corporate credit? Well, we see that the total number of our resources allocated as percentage of GDP has increased. What about the number of contracts? Well, if we analyze the total corporate credit lines at the market, we will see that the number of lines, open lines at the market increased also dramatically starting in 2006. So this period, 2006, January 2006, is like a breaking point in the trends on banking activity in Mexico. And if we go more in detail, the new contracts per month, which is a better measure of banking activity, also shows this increase starting in 2006. Before 2006, the creation of contracts per month, or per quarter in this case for the measure of what I have in the axis, were about 20,000 contracts per quarter or lower than 30,000 contracts per quarter. But starting 2006, the creation of contracts is, for instance, for the last year, 60,000 contracts per month in just 1 year. So the mass of availability of resources to entrepreneurs or to firms has increased dramatically.